Alright guys, today we're going to install the Eden Perfection flat trigger. Your trigger will come with the proper hex key, a set screw with thread locker already applied, and it will have a set screw installed that does not have any thread locker. This is useful as a spare or to play around with the adjustment while you kind of figure things out. We'll wear our safety glasses, 1.5mm punch may be needed, 1/8 punch, and I recommend brass or polymer tipped will be needed, a small hammer. Again, I recommend a polymer tip. We'll need a flat rigid tool during part of this process. A box cutter works great. Doesn't have to be this, but you'll see why this works so well. And a pair of needle nose pliers. I'm also going to use a small vise with a vise block and some padded vise jaws. You don't need these things, but it's going to help with the video. Finally, I like to use a bin or someplace to safely hold parts while I'm working. First, we're going to remove the rear slide guide. With the pistol field stripped, we'll remove the front pin, then the slide guide and hammer and everything, and then the rear pin. These pins do not need to be driven out. The pins have a little groove on the left side. They sit in here like this. A spring leg from the slide stop spring rests in that groove and keeps the pin from moving left or right. We're going to use our flat tool to lift up. We're going to come right in and then lift up on the front of that spring leg and then remove this pin to the side. So you can just stick the box cutter blade right in until it hits the pin and then lift up, and you'll see that spring leg come up on the top of the blade. Then I just use my thumbnail to press the pin and get it started. Once it's flush, you can let tension off of that leg, and you can use your smaller punch then just to push it out, and you'll see that it comes out quite easily. We'll set that aside. Now the slide guide can be rotated up and out, and I would hold on. You see the right side here, holding everything in. Sometimes this firing pin safety lever likes to come shooting off of there. Once you have it out, I would go ahead and pull that straight out and remove it. Be sure not to lose the spring. Now you can lift up. Here you can see the spring that holds those pins in place. You can lift up on the rear leg. You might need to hold the slide stop down. Just lift up a little bit to remove the tension on the rear pin, and it will come out easily. Now we'll remove the factory trigger. On the Mark II frames, we can simply lift the trigger bar or the transfer bar, whatever you want to call it, out a little bit so it releases from the mag spring there that puts downward tension on the magazine, and then we'll have this up and free to move. Then we will drive the trigger pin out from right to left using our 1/8 inch brass punch. Just pull it out. Again, this is for the Mark II. I'm going to use my needle nose pliers. You can use the special tool for this, but I'm going to remove the magazine catch. So I'm just going to grab a hold, lift up on that spring. Now your mag catch comes out. Now I can move the factory trigger and everything up just enough that I can pull this pin out. So pull the pin out, holding on to the spring, the trigger bar, and then the trigger itself will drop out through the bottom. That's the process for the Mark II. For the USG, we run into a little issue. We've got this support here that comes up on the side where the magazine runs. Because of that, you can't just lift the trigger up like I did there. So what we're actually going to have to do, or actually you might be able to, but you can't install a flat trigger. This one already has a flat trigger in it. But what you'll need to do here is use your smaller punch to remove the external safety. So first we'll drive the pin out like we did before, or at least part of the way out, enough to clear the spring that puts tension on the magazine. Once that pin clears that, you can reach in with your punch and push that spring rearward. Okay, that spring sits down and is going to block this roll pin, and we need to drive this roll pin out. So when we move that tension spring to the rear, it will free that up. We can use our small punch, drive that roll pin straight out the bottom. Don't have your safety engaged, have it off. Drive that roll pin out the bottom. Then you can remove this right side lever and carefully remove the safety to the left. You'll want to make sure and capture the detent and spring that are under the left side here and make sure those don't come flying out. So once you have that out of the way on the USGs, you can then remove the factory trigger, and that'll allow you to install the flat trigger. You do not need to remove the safety on the magazine catch on the USGs, but you do need to remove the safety. Now we'll install the trigger bar and trigger spring onto the Eden Perfection flat trigger. We'll start from the left side, pressing this pin in. This may be a tight fit, that's okay. We'll put our spring in. And push that pin in just far enough so that we still have room here to slide the trigger bar down into place. You may need to look through on this side of the trigger to get everything lined up. Press it in, and it's easy as that. Now what you're going to find, more than likely, is that once you do this, in a resting position, you have this kind of upward angle, and that's really going to add a little extra tension to the trigger that you probably don't want. So we're actually going to bend one leg of the trigger spring so that at a resting position, we have a little bit of an angle like this. You don't have to do this, but it does make for a nicer trigger feel. So we'll go ahead and take this back out. And this is where I'm going to use my needle nose pliers. Carefully, because these do like to go flying. And we will just put a little bit of a bend on it. Don't know if you can see that, but now when we install it, we will probably have a much better angle. As you can see, nothing too technical about that. Don't overdo it, like most things. You can always take it back out and bend it a little more if you need to. Perfect. Now we'll take our frame, simply drop our new trigger assembly down in from the top. Might have to wiggle a little bit to get everything to fit, just like that. Find our trigger pin wherever it got out to. It installs the opposite we took it out, so from left to right. Just like that. You can go ahead and drive it in at this point if you want, using the polymer side of your hammer. I'm actually going to wait. We're just pushing it in with hand pressure, so we'll do a function check first before we drive it in. Okay, now we can take this trigger bar, bend it away from the frame just enough to get it sat back down into place so that it is now held by the spring that puts downward pressure on the magazine. On the USG, because of the differences I noted earlier, we're going to go ahead and install the trigger and the spring and the trigger bar just like we did. We'll drop it down in and then start this pin just like we did before. But before we get it all the way in, we need to take this leaf spring and scoot it back forward. We had to scoot it to the rear earlier in the process to remove the safety. We're going to scoot it back forward into place, then press our pin in with hand pressure. Then we can take the safety and reinstall it from right to left. We'll have to get the spring and plunger down in place, and oftentimes you'll have to hold that down with your small punch as you slide this across. I wouldn't actually install the right hand side lever just yet. Just leave it like that because you may need to do a little fitting on the USGs. Just kind of depends, and we'll talk about that later. We've got our Mark II back in the vise, and we can install the rear slide guide. Before we do though, let's talk a little bit about the firing pin safety lever. As you pull the trigger bar down beneath pulls this lever, and the top interacts with the firing pin safety. So as you pull the trigger, it lifts the firing pin safety up out of the way. The adjustability on the Eden Perfection flat trigger is essentially pre-pulling that trigger for you. Because of this, it has a tendency to start to interact with the firing pin safety before we want it to. So because of that, we recommend slightly contouring this edge of the firing pin safety lever. Putting a slide angle on that will help that interact with the firing pin safety a little later in the travel, allowing you to adjust your flat trigger properly. So we'll do this for you. Simply remove your lever and ship it to us with your order number. We will recontour it and polish the top and ship it back with your trigger. There's no charge for this, so we encourage that option. Your gunsmith can do it as well. Either way, you need to check proper function of your safety. So we're going to go ahead and install this lever that's been contoured already. We'll get our spring and be careful because, again, these guys like to go flying. So as we install this, we want to make sure that the sear is down and the leg of the sear spring is up and against the rear of the frame. We're also going to need to make sure that the lever is in a forward position. Otherwise, it will get in the wrong spot on the trigger bar and won't function properly. So we'll set this down into place. Again, making sure that our sear spring is up and against the back of the frame. I'm actually going to rock it a little bit like this, which helps me make sure I get that lever in place. Can set it down in, easily push my pin from left to right. I say easily, you may have to wiggle a little bit. It goes right in. And here we can actually do a quick function check. As I pull the trigger, the firing pin safety lever should move. You need to keep pressure on this because of the tension of the sear spring, which you should be able to see that leg sticking up right here, tries to push everything forward. So hold on to that. We're going to take our box cutter again, or whatever you're using to lift this spring leg up, and we're going to lift it right up like we did when we removed this front pin. And then we're going to start to push this pin in, and as we do, we'll have to push the slide stop down until the hole lines up, just like that. Okay. And again, once you're finished with that, make sure that that spring leg is on top of the pin, retaining it like it's supposed to, and do a quick function check and make sure that your lever is operating. Now that we've got it all back together, we'll do some function checks. Since this still has the magazine disconnect intact, we'll insert a magazine, manually cock the hammer. And we're going to pull the trigger and make sure it fully releases the hammer. Now, I'm not going to let the hammer fall at full speed. I'm going to control it with my other hand. Okay, that's good. We'll check the disconnect by pushing the trigger bar down, letting it reset. Good release. Okay, you want to make sure that's functioning properly. On the USGs in particular, you may have to do a little fitting of the trigger, and you can see that on this model just down in this area. Sometimes that trigger will hit the safety crossbar before it's able to release the hammer, so you just need to remove a little material from the trigger itself. A small file works great for that. Again, that's why we didn't install everything completely before, because we may have to do a little fitting, again, particularly on the USGs. Now we can adjust the trigger. If you want to play around with it and just understand and learn the adjustment, you can do that with the included set screw that does not have thread locker. But when you do your final set, it really needs to have thread locker on it. Otherwise, it could back out and mess up your function. So what we're going to do first is, with the safety on, we're just going to pull the trigger gently against the safety, and we'll run that screw down until it contacts the frame. You don't need to over tighten it. You may have a little play there. That's fine. And again, we'll have to check this with a magazine. All we're going to do now is cock the hammer, and we're actually going to disconnect it. So we've got the trigger pulled, we've got it disconnected, the hammer's back. We're going to let up on the trigger. We want it to reset. As we can see here, it's not resetting properly. So we're going to use our hex key, and we're going to back that out until it resets. Once it does that, go another about 1/8 of a turn or so, just so you have some good clearance there. And now let's do our function checks again. just like we did before. Great function every time. And now the trigger is set. Now that we've done our initial checks, we can go ahead and finish installing the trigger pin. I'm going to use my polymer side on my hammer just to tap that into place. Now it's fully installed. If you've got a USG, you're going to fully install the safety, assuming you've got your trigger fit if necessary. And we'll reassemble the slide. Okay. Now this is going to be a little difficult to show on the video, but we need to check the function of the firing pin safety. All right, so we have no ammo. We're going to, with the safety on, the external safety on, see if we can do this. We're going to use the hex key that comes with the trigger, and we're going to insert it in the back of the slide. The hammer's cocked at this point, and it's going to be at a bit of an angle, and you're going to find the firing pin, and you should be able to push the firing pin a little bit, and it will contact the firing pin safety. You can feel the spring-loaded firing pin. What we're going to do with the safety on first, and I'm going to have to put this in kind of a funny position here, is we're going to go ahead and pull the trigger against the safety and make sure that our firing pin safety is still blocking the firing pin. We don't want that firing pin to move all the way forward. You can start with the trigger fully released and then put some pressure on it, and then, or maybe continually press as you pull the trigger towards the rear. Have it dead stop against the external safety and make sure that that firing pin doesn't move. If it does move, you'll need to take it apart, take that firing pin safety lever and contour that a little more, put a little bit more of an angle on it. If you have to do this, work slowly and repeat the process until that safety functions properly. Okay, so here we're good to go. We're going to take our safety off. Again, we don't have any ammo in the area, and we're going to do the same thing, but now we're going to have to pull the trigger and make sure that as we're pulling that trigger, our safety disengages. So again, it may be a little difficult to do and show, but I'm going to push a little bit, and I'm going to try to pull that trigger about halfway. And there we've got full movement. I don't know if you can see that or not, but when I pull the trigger, we get full movement. I can hold the firing pin down, let up on the trigger, and then release the firing pin, and you'll hear it click back. That's the safety going back to block it. So you have to make sure that that's working properly. If it's not, a little more contouring of the firing pin safety lever will be needed. Anyway, that's now installed and ready to rock. This gun I'm actually going to take back apart. We're going to do a full trigger job on it. So looks great, feels good as far as the trigger itself, but we're going to drop this trigger pull from about 6.5 pounds down to around 3.5.